with that, we must rush headlong into our next speaker. Deanna Petherbridge is Emeritus Professor and also visiting professor of drawing at the University of Arts, London. She was also professor of drawing at the Royal College of Art from 1995 to 2001, where she launched the Center for Drawing Research, the first doctoral program in drawing in the UK. Professor Petherbridge is also an artist, writer, and curator, primarily concerned with drawing. In her 2010 book, The Primacy of Drawing, Histories and Theories of Practice, was published in June 2010 by Yale University Press in the US and UK, and examines the importance of drawing as a significant practice in Western art history from the 15th century to the present. It is a seminal and beautiful piece of work. Professor Petherbridge.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you also for inviting me here as a non-architect. I have to say that I haven't been into a review and I haven't been into a design studio for at least 12 years, so I'm very much an outsider. But I also want to congratulate you on the exhibition of drawings made by, which is upstairs around the Solari exhibition, and I was so impressed with it. They're so intense. It's such a good program here. So I would really like to congratulate you. As I'm talking within the historical section of this conference, I have framed my not always entirely solemn views on aspects of architectural drawing and my critique of contemporary visualization images with a brief contextual preview of drawings from the 1980s, the time that I was teaching drawing at the Architectural Association in London and writing for a range of architectural journals. The following images, I'm afraid, are probably pretty familiar stuff, but perhaps I approach them slightly differently from the viewpoint of a generalist drawing scholar. Peter Cook, Christine Hawley, and Archigram, with their plug-in cities and visions of benignly mechanized techno-environments, had set the scene for a British love-in with drawing and futurology in the 1970s. But the reasons for the graphic explosion in the next decade were also profoundly economic. Many of today's celebrity architects from this generation spent years in a graphic wilderness, drawing, thinking, teaching, and inventing, if not building. Although the 20th century had witnessed a total breakdown of media distinctions and artistic hierarchies, drawing as dream, abstraction, or manifesto remained the only possible alternative for out-of-work architects at the time. Perhaps it was this enforced period of a sort of Kantian transcendental idealism that has made it so difficult to embrace, so difficult for some of us, to embrace the instrumentalist view of the present day, that drawing is an entirely pragmatic and mechanistic activity of no particular aesthetic value or consequence. The fine monochrome drawings of James Wines for Best Products built between 1972 and 84 were potent in a different way, I think. The drawings... Is this me making a kind of bumpy noise? That's fine. That's just heavy breathing, is it? Thank you. I apologize. Okay. The drawings were potent in a different way from the actual warehouse buildings, dependent on surrealist humor. The traditional skills, and I think these are most beautiful drawings, and they work with very traditional skills of finely manipulated pen and ink textures or loosely applied charcoal strokes. Those in the image on the right deliberately mime the directional application of tarmac that was to swamp and roll over the drowned vehicles. All of these suggest more subtle readings, I would suggest, than the performative aspect of the actual buildings, as verbal visual puns and built-in possibilities. This seems to me an interesting and potent mismatch, and I'm not saying it's a critique, just as a comment, Normally, a building is the most complex and accretionary state of a developmental process that involves drawing. But the 1970s site warehouses were single-state enactments or performances arising from very rich drawings that continued themselves to participate in other narratives and histories. The parallelism and frontality of these drawings, as in most of the drawn examples, which I will be showing in the next slides, are the embedded signifiers of architecturalism and the inescapable referentiality of architectural graphics. And I say this because, of course, so much fine art drawing is not necessarily referential in the same way. The slide rule and right angle are implicated within these drawing board images, in spite of their conceptual anarchy, as well as the dominating gaze of perspective, to apply a phrase from Alberto Pérez Gómez, or other kinds of projective geometries. This might seem a very obvious comment, but the drawings of this era were offered on an open market, so to speak, and were competing with the art world offerings of conceptual art and postmodernism that had eschewed all such structural frameworks. The drawings of the late Raymond Abram melded colored pencil and watercolor in evocative and slightly melancholy images, evoking discourses of archetypes, archaeology, rituals. Firmly frontal, if laterally indeterminate, they usually depended on a horizon division as a form of philosophical plimsoll line, with buildings and carved spaces articulated above and below it. This is the ground, if I may possibly use such a loaded term, and I think of Dalibor Vézelay every time I say ground, so that's why I'm saying it apologetically. This is the ground that traditionally separates applied perspective construction from the space of pure mathematics. As laid out in the watercolor drawing by Friedrich Gilly, who was a mentor of Schinkel, though he is very much the same age, a geometric metaspace traditionally occurs below and beneath historical perspective drawings, shaping and shadowing the pictorial application. And this, of course, is in textbooks, not in the early Renaissance examples we saw earlier. The 1980s penchant for excavation that challenges the certainties of a ground line was noticeable in many iconic drawings that also doubled as manifestos at this time. Gaetano Pesce, visiting New York, buried a church below a vacant lot between city towers, and Walter Pichler buried into a tentative and ambivalent ground plane in this very subtle but contradictory image. Emilia Ambaz carved out a sunken chapel, reminiscent perhaps of the Ethiopian rock-cut churches of Lalibela, in his iconic cooperative Mexican-American grape growers project, Santa Rosa, California, 1976. I think, therefore, and I'm suggesting by showing these these cut-out drawings, that there's a haptic correlation between the textural responses of a feeling hand, which happens in these drawings, and the representations that appear to sink into the fibrous paper surface to carve out spaces. And this hapticity, of course, is something that has been replaced in computer drawings, as we'll be looking at later. I contrast this, particularly in these drawings, with the ubiquitous shiny and reflective surfaces that I'm going to be very critical of, that we'll see later. Axonometrics and isometrics were most commonly the generators of strict form, and supposedly, as we all read, about objective spaces in the 1970s and 80s. And yet, when you look at this a selection of images, they could engender the most romantic, evocative, and inventive, in a way, pictorial renderings by very diverse architects carrying out very diverse programs. Again, I draw your attention to the predominance of the ground plane and its desire for embellishment, something, again, which I think has very radically changed. Axonometrics were also the generators of boldly abstract elevations and sections, free of shadows, but encompassing textures and elaborate facade superimpositions, and lovingly, if very laboriously rendered, in the very determinant medium of colored pencils. And these were favored at the time, I think, because they maintained the formal linearity of traditional drawing tools. They could be laid down, and they could be very pleasurably cross-hatched. Could take hours and hours to really enjoy making a drawing with a ruler, and their discrete coloration and textural inflections could simultaneously participate in other forms of color-coded structural systems, as you'll particularly see, of course, in the Sterling drawing, without a change of register. That's quite complex, but what I'm saying is the colors are both about the colors that are going to come into the facade. They're facade colors, they're predetermining colors, but they're also color coding in very many other structural ways. So these drawings that look quite simple are actually quite complex in terms of overlaying. Representation and diagram are also two very different things in drawing, are therefore united and unified two-dimensionally as a set of equivalences that would directly influence the decorative geometries of the built form. In encompassing the potency and transparency of axonometric projection for generating a powerful new modernism, I do believe it was the force of Daniel Libeskin's drawings that blew apart the static concepts of 1980s architecture, possibly forever. He wasn't alone in this, but I think his drawings were very important in this event. By moving away from what he termed the stabilized frameworks of drawings as, I quote, the fixed and silent accomplices of building and construction, into these compressed fragments which always defy orientation, and his drawings themselves are very often shown in different ways too, because they are not about a particular orientation. Libeskin not only enabled his own subsequent buildings to challenge the pull of gravity, but he inspired an architectural revolution for many, including students. And I'd like to say that I think it could be said that the move away from traditional orthogonal trabeatus that has so radically marked architecture of the last 2 decades, I believe was a graphic invention waiting for computer technology to invigorate its hubristic propositions. The Micromegas drawings and the more romantic drawings that followed, I don't have the date of the other drawing on the screen, have of course also since inspired many other non-architects such as the American Ethiopian artist Julie Mehretu. By the mid-1990s, when I was installed at the Royal College of Art to run drawing studios, and I regret to say they were more inspired propositional cabarets than structured lessons, totally anarchic but sometimes fun, where animation, architecture, industrial design, and so on, people attended from all across the school. By this time, the CAD revolution had already exploded. Other forms of computer imaging, however, and I'm making the distinction, and in this I'm probably very ignorant, between the straightforward CAD that works out where you work out your drawing, and between the kinds of imaging processes you're going to use at the end product. And these were still very much in a state of slightly painful technical evolution. This implied that potentially design historians would be able to construct a historiography of computer styles and be able to date the types of imagery that had fed back so transparently into the architecture of the day. And I hope I'm not being unfair, but I do feel this Isozaki building looks exactly like what was then being invented, the absolute joy of being able to construct cubes and so on computers, and I feel it fed back. There was a two-way passage, should we say. I do feel it's conditioned in some way by the technological limitations of imaging systems of the day. A historical analysis, however, depends on the potential of digital expansion beyond the founding computational models that have shaped the conventional perspectival space and constructional principles of image making. In 1997, Alberto Pérez Gómez had written that, I quote, "Computers have contributed next to nothing towards destructuring the hegemony of panoptic space and proposing a more meaningful and participatory urban space." And I'm quoting him again, "The tyranny of computer-aided design and its graphic systems can be awesome, because its rigorous mathematical basis is unshakable. It rigidly establishes a homogeneous space and is inherently unable to combine different structures of reference. And I'm quoting him from 1997 and showing you these images to say not all that much seems to have changed. The lower images on the slide derive from the 1990s, but are not substantially different from a design project in the year 2000, which is that curious little creature sitting in the desert. And it's actually a tent, I've discovered, with a sort of built-in something or other that keeps you warm at night. Or even the, or even the imagery of my next slide on the other side of that is an interactive PlayStation game, which is just issued. It's just come on the market now. And it requires teams of soldiers and engineers to defend the Ark, built as a self-sustaining city of the future, but now falling into disrepair. There's some message that the future can also disappear. The static, frozen frontality and slippery curves of this range of cliched digital imagery, to me, acts as a mask or blanket on difference. It masks originality and affect, emotion, not to mention building type, programmatic intention, spatial social environments, or philosophies of style, or the 1001 determinants that shape architectural expression. It seemed to me really curious that that little scheme by Eva Jarikna had suddenly discovered Victoria Rock and London in a state London has never been and never will be. Let me make it clear, in spite of my mock melancholy use of an image by Michelangelo, which I started the lectures, I am not for one moment going along with the proposition that drawing is dead. I don't believe it for a moment. Far from it, I believe that architectural form, which is always driven and sustained by drawing of some kind, is particularly vibrant and inventive at this time. And it's a wonderful and interesting and inventive age we're living in, albeit often cited in inimical urban contexts. And I don't just mean that the wonderful buildings everybody's building are inside inimical urban contexts. I feel they very often create very problematic urban contexts. I think there's often a huge conflict between marvelous architecture and urban sites, but we can't have time for that. I am, however, making a clear distinction between those forms of drawing and diagram which are associated with invention, critical analysis, communication, problem solving, development, and so on, whether hand or technological difference or technological driven. I make a difference between that and the use of a stale kind of heavily restricted cyber imagery that is only purports to represent the built product and is not dealing at all with any of the kind of ideological facts which lie between a work and its representation. There is no longer a useful nomenclature for these kinds of promotional images, although they used to be called renderings or presentation drawings. And it seems to me that this typological lack is a minor, but nevertheless a significant casualty of technophilia. In the past, the conceptual and physical acts of drawing and design development were produced serially in a mutually determined time frame and employed codified, we know this all, codified and designated modes of graphic production, marked by breaks and interruptions, allowing for invention and dialogue. Such acts are now embodied within a seamless, supposedly seamless and continuous mode of production, sometimes curiously at odds with the fragmented paradigms that they purport to explore. Of course, this notion of seamlessness is an illusion in a chain of technological shifts, from the employment of electronic sketchpads to CAD workstations to the expert accessing of a successive number of sophisticated programs, including the means for manipulating moving imagery, which is often part of the skills needed for presenting buildings, the task of designing and construction engineering now involves a whole chain of experts and specialists employing different hardware and software, all of whose activities and records need to be correlated. The plug-in connectivity of all these diverse systems is modeled on the unshakable, and I really do question this, valorization of the integrative World Wide Web as the cosmic paradigm. We all subscribe to it, we don't question it. This means that nothing whatsoever can escape the continuously masticating digestive tracts of the omnivorous cyber mouth, a notion, of course, that had previously belonged to hell. With the inclusion of what were previously differentiated modes of thinking drawing into such a universalizing system, architects are left, and this was said by the previous speaker, architects are left with very few non-mechanical drawing options, apart from those rapid first thought sketches that museums, of course, are very eager to collect. And my example of such a drawing by Tom Main indicates how extremely informative such generative sketches are in allowing us to understand the thinking and development of a design concept. Nevertheless, the cult of the sketch as a collectible can also function in a very different way. Just as British artist Damien Hirst belatedly saw the commercial imperative of post-production sketches to promote his Duchampian-inspired vitrines of sharks and what have you pickled in formaldehyde, so for some architectural practices, sketches now function as a species of logo identity, intended to humanize huge projects. Such sketches might not really be about autograph or origins of ideas, but they set out to proclaim the human eye and hand concealed within the computer, which has now, as predicted by Pichler, become a prosthetic extension of the body for most architects. By contrast, this slide shows freewheeling sketches of different dates by Frank Gehry, whose public persona, as was said by the previous speaker, is so closely identified with hand drawing. These drawings follow in the long tradition of the conceptual and generative first sketch as formally indeterminate, even inchoate, speedy, careless, full of corrections or pentimenti, as the hand follows rapidly evolving ideas, immaterial, contingent, open-ended, because issues such as scale or materials or structural determinants or social programs have not yet been finalized. In these small sketches, we can just follow, in this particular selection, how the building gradually clarifies and frees itself from the mass of swirling and gestural lines in which it is entrapped. The difference between the fragile sketch and the immense complexity of Gehry's final project could not be greater. In this context, high technology signifies a magical and transformative means that appears to fill the unbridgeable void between concept and build realization. Of course, Gehry's practice moves in real time far more gradually between low and high tech, through degrees of crushed paper, to constructed 3D models, etc., and drawings that allow translations into built form via super software, which I believe we'll be hearing about tomorrow. The enabling and transformative sophistication of the technology implied by the Gehry office means that the firm can now even build buildings that appear to have all the contingency, seeming fragility, lack of closure, and determinacy of primi pensieri, first thought sketches. The small autographic sketch, for centuries understood as the very antithesis of fixed form, material, and scale, while suggestive of such possibilities, here has actually become identified with its instantiation. and possibly it could be argued identified but not reconciled. If I knew anything about philosophy, I think I would assume that all sorts of ontological and teleological propositions are set into a state of unease by these very extraordinary acts. Technology's endeavors to undermine physical laws outside as well as within the phantasmagoria of virtual reality have, of course, been a common visual trope of postmodernism. And I refer you to Will Alsop's 2005 building, the Center for Cognition, Culture and Computation. Everywhere over the world, they're all getting together, all of us, computation and culture, which functions as a space for visual art students in association with digital workshops. And his scribble sculpture was, of course, developed in 3D from a CAD model. Of course, nothing as simple as a linear scribble can remain in cyberspace. It immediately slides into a potentiality of seamless and endless transformations in other media, times and contexts. The 1990s obsession, everybody was a deconstructionist in architecture in those days, but the obsession with Jacques Derrida's endless chain of meaning deferral, I think here find visual or at least cyber-real counterparts. If high technology has now served to establish an almost inconceivable differentiation between sketch and built outcome, or a chimeric identification of hybrid states both inside and outside cyberspace, it should not be forgotten that this was not so within traditional building paradigms. And this drawing by Eric Mendelsohn, one of very many for the Einstein Tower, signals a clear phenomenological relationship between the well-practiced curves of the drawing hand and the taut arched forms of the final built project in Potsdam. The determinedly autographic drawing, with its variable brush lines arising from Mendelssohn's trademark curved horizon, appears to prefigure in some way the active forms of three-dimensional plasticity with all the verve of a sculptor. And Mendelssohn, we know, didn't sustain this embodied isomorphism in his later works. And I included the previous drawing in order to contrast it with the promise of haptic interface effects offered by digital sketch pads. According to the blurb for Sketchbook Pro, I quote, "Because it makes use of the pressure sensitivity features of Wacom tablets, tablet PCs, and iPhones, it can help artists sketch and create effects similar to traditional materials." And I've deliberately shown the advertised visuals for this because the type of broad and fibrous sketch marks drawn on the screen are presumably meant to project evidence of the expressivity of natural hand pressures made possible on gesture-based used interface. However, rather than suggesting to me that drawing is a free and open-ended activity that can be adapted for any kinds of purpose and future state, this quick-fix advert projects a standardized, multi-purpose, grotesque imagery of manga cartoons that inhabits the entire visual graphic world, from computer games to animation. And this is a hegemonic type of graphic imagery that is also an invading visual virus, simultaneously controlling and undermining powerful cyber systems. It's a wry thought that in such virtual games and animations, built form is usually only set up in order to be trashed, exploded, and destroyed while everybody runs around killing each other. Cyber aggression is as careless, I would say, with architecture as it is with the lives of avatars. And in support and also defeat of my own argument, I've included images from a very brilliant little animated film, Robots of Brixton, made by a student at Bartlett School, University of London, which recently got a prize at the Royal Institute of British Architects. And it deals with rioting robots attempting to rebuild destroyed urban spaces and dysfunctional social housing. Tadeo Ando's declamatory, even triumphalist drawing, which probably or could have been made after the event, celebrates the geometrical potency of the temple, this beautiful temple as inflected by the gestural imperfections of his swift hand. Except for the central bisecting vertical and horizontal, this emblematic inscription has little to do with the haunting textural and spatial subtleties of the built temple above and below ground, but it certainly informs us about the structural and formal potency of simple geometric juxtapositions. I suggest that when all drawing designing processes happen within the virtual confines of screen and infrastructural programs, caught up in the relentless onward drive of seamless computing, those ruptures that are very necessary for decision-making become elided and weakened. This drawing, however, reminds us of the power of the drawing as punctum, or halted moment, in a developmental continuum. Perhaps this is why Ando has returned to a curiously old-fashioned collage-style drawing methodology in this sketch for the Shanghai Polytheatre, and the drawings and models were recently shown at Gallery GA in Tokyo last year. The great sweeping circular holes that are torn into the prismatic theatre complex to function as an amphitheatre, terrace and foyer recall the Anna architecture of Gordon Matter Clark and his situationalist work, Conical Intersect 1975 below, where a circular viewing hole was cut through one of the about-to-be-demolished buildings on the Rue de Beaubourg in Paris. The juxtaposed work above on the screen is a piece by the English artist Richard Wilson for the Liverpool Biennale in 2008. And I couldn't, unfortunately, find his drawing, but it's very, very similar to the Tadeo Ando drawing. And he also used crude lines over photographs, very old-fashioned means of drawing, for this building, stylistically very closely. And I wondered about it, and I thought about it, and I decided perhaps this deliberate crassness of means, employed by somebody with all the subtlety of Ando, means that drawing now, it's been important to become an indexical sign of those brutal scars of interventions into the holistic fabric of existing buildings. And we're near the end now, and I'm not bad on time. This slide posits the difference between an extraordinary expressive and gestural drawing of Hans Hollein from 1962, where one can virtually feel the action of the outstretched arms of a crucified figure marking the horizontal plank of a cruciform shape, and a recent project where, again, such cantilevered forms are being employed. The tentative nature of the little project sketch on your left, relates maybe, I wondered, why is his drawing so changed? Why is it so tentative now? And I thought maybe it's a nervous expectation of the blanketing effect of computer visualizations in a technophilia age that I've referred to before and that I've illustrated on the right. After all, this is an image that's put out by Hollein's office. Drowning by computer. Present-day visualizations are so hybrid that it's often difficult to know whether digital photography, with its ability to be endlessly touched up and smoothed over, is simulating constructed computer simulations or vice versa. And perhaps it is this hybridity that defies the evolution of a useful critical discourse, which is what I'm promoting in this presentation. I end with two arbitrary selective visualizations for competition projects. And I chose competition projects because then at least you know that this is clever computing images and not doctored digital photographs. There are gathering clouds in the neoclassical Schinkelesque perspective vision on the left, but not a single cloud disturbs the frozen perfections of the Cartesian spaces of contemporary England or Abu Dhabi, clear-cut against their cloudless skies and safe in the unitary climate of cyberspace and the timeless embrace of perspectivalism. The obligatory water reflections could be interpreted maybe as etiolated references to a more modern semiotics of reflexivity, but probably not. Thank you very much.
Deanna, thank you. That was terrific.